So we're picking off where we left off with the previous video where we introduced a motion sensor. This time we're bringing in a rotational sensor, and that will be read by the analog pin here. Similar to the previous sensor, there is a 5-volt power supply that goes to the sensor. It's sent to ground as well. So these are the two providing the power to the sensor. The third wire, the green wire here, is the information that's being sent back to the Arduino and being read through the analog pin. In this case, it's A0. We still have our LED light set up to 13 and ground over here. And so it's a similar setup to what we had before. So let's get into the programming of this. We can begin again by loading the previous program we've had in the past, which is an LED test. And we're going to rename that. So we're going to save it as LED and rotation sensor test. So we've done that. And just like in the previous demonstration, we need to communicate to the Arduino that we have a new piece of equipment attached to the Arduino. And so we're going to do that here. We're going to introduce our data type, and then we're going to call this rotation pin. And again, I mentioned we were set up on the analog pin 0, so we're going to put A0. So that tells it where to look. Then we're going to have a pin mode, rotation pin, it's an input, so we're going to be reading the information on that pin. And then we're going to go back into our loop. So let's just get rid of this previous information here. We're going to introduce a value like we did with the motion sensor here, and we're going to call it rotation value. Last time we called it sensor value, we'll do it rotation value here. And this time instead of digital read, we're going to say analog read. And then we need to tell it what to read. So we're going to say rotation pin. We've now set it up to read that analog pin. And now we're going to ask a question. And the question is going to be if the rotation value is, let's say, less than 500, do this. Before we get into that, I just wanted to kind of come back to what's going on here. The rest we've talked about before. We're asking a question about this value, and the less than sign, like the double equal sign, is a comparison value or question. When using analog, it ranges from 0 to 1024. 512 will be halfway through that. So what we're asking the Arduino right now is that if the rotation value is less than 512, or in a sense less than halfway, then we're going to do something. And so we'll say we're going to digital write our LED pin high. So we've talked about what that does before. And now I want to introduce something new here, and that is the if statement can, let's just put a little thing here. End of loop. I mentioned before it can get a bit confusing when we have multiple closing brackets. This is just a way of separating that. So there is an if statement, but you can also have an if else. It's kind of like an either or statement. And so we're asking before, if it was just an if statement, it would check if this is true. If it's not, it just kind of skips beyond it. But if we add an additional alternative, we can have it do something else. And so what happens is it checks this condition. It says, is the value of the rotation less than halfway? If it is, then write that. But then we're adding an additional line which says, if it is not that, then else we're going to do something different. And in this case, we're going to write the LED pin low. Let's go ahead and upload this, and we'll see what it looks like. And then I want to come back to this and add one more piece of information so that we can understand how we can use the serial monitor to look at what's actually happening in our program. But let's go ahead and upload this now. So it looks like we have a problem here. So this is an example of an issue and how sensitive things are. I forgot to put an I in the digital write, and you'll see that you get an error message. If I had misspelled something else along the way, a similar thing could happen if I had misspelled rotation or something like that. Another way to check this is also using the check mark here rather than uploading it. It'll check through the program and it'll give you a message at the bottom that the compiling is done. So let's try this again. We're going to upload that to the board. And so now we're here with our rotation sensor. And if I turn it the one way, nothing happens. If I turn it the other way, the LED suddenly turns on. So this here is the halfway point. Anything above that, it stays on. Anything below that, it stays off. So let's go back to our program for a sec. I want to add a little bit more coding which will help you see where you are in the program and identify the actual information that's being input into your Arduino. Within setup, so we're going to write in the word serial period begin. You'll notice again that the color changes. It's because we're using pre-written code. And then we're going to write 9600. Now that we've kind of established that we're going to add a serial monitor to our program, right up at the top of our loop, as soon as we finish telling the rotation value that it is equal to whatever is being read on this pin, we're going to write that out so that we can check it. So we're going to say serial, and this time we're going to write down print line. You'll again notice that the color changes. It's kind of preconceived code. You'll also notice that print on its own is also that. The difference between print and print line is that if it's just print, everything will be written on the same line and it will never break down into a new line. If you put NL, every piece of information in your monitor, which we'll see in a minute, is placed on a new line. And so now we're going to tell it what to print. We're going to write down rotation value. What's being read in the analog here is a number. It's reading numbers between 0 and 1024. And this name here holds on to that number value. And so when we write serial print rotation value, what we're going to get is the number that's associated with that value. And that's going to change depending on where and how we control that dial. We need to close this off with a semicolon again to end that statement. Now we can upload that program back to the Arduino. And this time if you go to the top right corner, you'll see a magnifying glass. And when you go over it, it says serial monitor. We're going to click on that and open that up. You'll notice a bunch of numbers running in there. Now I'm going to adjust the rotation sensor and you can see how, so I'm now turning it down and you can see that the value is down. And the LED light is on because we're below 512. As I turn this up, you can see it again going up, and as soon as we're going to reach 512, the LED light has now turned off. So this is a way of kind of monitoring pieces of information as you go along. I'm going to end this video here, and we're going to kind of pick up where we left off directly into the next, where we're going to add a little bit more complexity to this particular sensor.